and here we have our hunk. I'd like to have seen him actually looking a bit fatter, if that makes sense. Now this is really, this is pushing things way too far. Hello, I'm Daisy Dunn. I'm an author and a classicist, and I'm here with History Hit to do a deep dive into the film Pompeii. This is quite nice. This is a shot of the casts or pretend casts of the people who died in the eruption of Pompeii. I've got a quote. "This looks to me like it's Pliny the Younger, who was the only eyewitness we have of the eruption." It seems quite accurately translated from the Latin, so that's good. That's annoying. There's a mistake right at that final moment. Pliny the Younger, AD 79. It's true, the volcano erupted in AD 79, but Pliny the Younger did not write those words in the same year. He actually wrote those words nearly 30 years later. So it's wrong to put the date up at that moment. It's quite annoying actually for the historian. So these are the casts that were created of victims who were found buried in the debris that came out of the volcano that year. And they show us the final positions of those people. So over 100 of them have been made. They're actually made by putting plaster into the imprints that the bodies, as they decompose, left behind in the pumice and the stone. So they're not actually the bodies themselves, but rather a cast made around them. Okay, so we've got something flashing like the rebellion of the Celtic horse tribes in capitals. This isn't a battle that is familiar from any of the ancient sources. It seems strange that they're going to AD 62 rather than going back to the Boudica rebellion, which is AD 60 to 61. So presumably they're trying to capture pockets of resistance that remain in the northern part of Britannia, but it seems rather far-fetched, rather peculiar to be going to this kind of strange mythical scene. It all looks quite violent, and it evokes the Boudican rebellion. I don't know why they didn't just do the Boudican rebellion. It seems weird.
The governor wants these trade routes reopened. These rebel Celts need to be dealt with once and for all. This entire territory requires a clear and well-defined message.
Yes, Tribune Corvus.
Kill them. Kill them all.
I don't know why they'd have been seeking to wipe out this village after the Boudican rebellion. It doesn't quite make sense, and why we actually need it for the story either. Londinium. I like this shot. We're seeing the city laid out. It looks, I have to say, my first impression is it looks very, very built up, considering that much of it had been completely laid waste to during the Boudiccan Rebellion only 17 years earlier. That said, we've got the city in the right place. So the ancient city of Londinium was east of the modern capital, so it's more in the city of London, as we call it today. The Thames running along the bottom. I'm particularly pleased with this. We've got the Walbrook, this kind of tributary leading off the Thames, is the River Walbrook, which is now a subterranean river. And Londinium was built up around this for reasons of trade, so that all looks quite accurate. It's raining, of course, because it's Britain. The walls are actually very, very accurate for where they should be. The only problem is that the walls going around the city were built decades after this is supposed to be. So we're talking, 50, 60 years forward in time at least. Similarly, up in this top left corner, we have, this is Cripplegate Fort, which is accurate, but that was built about 120 AD, and we're here in sort of 79. So timing-wise, it's completely wrong, and it's very, very frustrating. So they've obviously gone to a huge amount of effort to get this very, very accurate in terms of, sort of the archaeology and the architecture of the city, but the timing is really off. So we're now in an amphitheatre, and fortunately an amphitheatre definitely did exist in Londinium by this date, so that is fine.
These Thracians are far too costly to feed. They're always maiming the guards. I'm looking for something new, Volato. Something fresh.
And here we have our hunk. I have to say, as of Roman gladiators, we now know that they had mainly a vegan diet or a sort of vegetarian diet. So they ate mainly beans, they ate lots of grain. And the idea was generally to build up a really sort of thick layer of fat beneath the skin. So if they were injured, if they were stabbed, they'd have a sort of quite a bloody wound, but they wouldn't actually be injured to such a degree that they couldn't fight on. So there'd be quite surface wounds rather than really devastating wounds or kind of wounds to organs. So I'd like to have seen him actually looking a bit fatter, if that makes sense. I think he should have been a little bit fatter at this stage. I think, he's looking very, very ripped, and I'm sorry to say that I think most Roman gladiators were actually a little bit on the tubby side. This is quite strange. So Thracians were a type of gladiator, and they usually had a sort of a small shield, they had a scimitar and a helmet. They definitely were not carrying tridents. Tridents were carried by the net catcher, the retiari type of gladiators. So there seems to have been a bit of a fudge between two different types of gladiator. Oh, this is surprising. This is a schizo gladiator. So this is actually quite a rare type of gladiator. They had this sort of rounded blade, which is kind of attached to the arm via a tube, and this sort of big, heavy helmet. But they weren't gladiators that you're coming across regularly by comparison with Thracians and net catchers and other types. This is quite extreme, I have to say. When gladiators were in training, they would have been trying to preserve their lives. They could go out to fight. It wasn't common for them to be killing each other while they're just training in the barracks, because gladiators were really, really expensive to train up and to preserve. So even when they're going out to fight, there's probably about 1 in 8 who are actually dying in battle. So in this kind of situation, it seems slightly bizarre to be killing them off.
We're home.
This is a nice opening shot of Pompeii. It's slightly model village-like, perhaps, but we've got a nice tomb-lined road. They definitely existed in the ancient world. The volcano in the distance, I'm slightly less happy with. Today we see Vesuvius as these sort of two peaks, but at this time, before it erupted, it looked very much more like a mountain. So you expect this kind of triangle rather than having two peaks. And I think here you're seeing slightly too much of this. You're seeing too much of this caldera, which was sort of created during the eruption itself. So at this time, most people believe that this was a mountain. A modern fresco, a contemporary fresco at that time shows the volcano very much as this kind of single peak like this. So I think this looks a little bit too volcano-like. Festival of the Vernalia. So from this, that happened on the 19th of August. It was a festival held in honour of Bacchus, the god of wine. And it suggests already that they're going to go with a traditional date for the eruption of Vesuvius. That is the 24th of August. That's the date that's come down through some of the manuscripts of Pliny the Younger's letters. But in recent years, there's been a great amount of questioning as to the accuracy of that date, because the archaeological record seems to suggest that the eruption took place further into the year, further into autumn, and it looks much more likely to have been October or November. This is a really beautiful bird's eye view of the city of Pompeii. We've got lots of these sort of insulae, these blocks that they had that we can still find in the ground plan, with these gardens in between. In the middle here, we've got this round thing here. It's the Macellum, which was the sort of the marketplace, and it did look a lot like that, with a lovely arch right next to it. That was there. And here we have a temple, which is the temple of Capitoline Jupiter and Juno and Minerva. So it's sort of the triad of deities. And that opened out onto the forum, which again looks very, very accurate to me. We've got a sort of a temple of Apollo to the side. We've got some warehouses down here. I'm really impressed with this. What are these women wearing? Roman women typically dressed in quite a conservative manner. They wore a tunic, they wore a stola. They were not going around the streets wearing plunging necklines and having cleavage on show. This again is sort of stretching reality. You wouldn't have had respectable women rushing through a city on their own. When women went out, they had to be protected by a male guardian, as they called it. That was usually their father or their husband. They weren't sort of running free through the city on their own.
I remember every statue, every street corner.
And they're coming here to something called a thermopolium, and these existed on sort of a lot of the street corners in Pompeii. They're essentially sort of a fast food stand, and they had these sort of gaps for sort of sunken vats of food that you could kind of keep warm, like soups and various things like that. So that looks very accurate, and I also highly approve of these bread rolls they have here. We know from the carbonized rolls that they found at Pompeii that they were usually baked round, and they had these sort of cut sections for dividing the bread up and sharing it. I like this sunken street here in Pompeii. They existed with these sort of stepping stones as well. I have to say my one criticism is the street is a little bit too clean. In antiquity, it would have been running with muck, it would have been sort of waste, and this is partly why you had these stepping stones, so you didn't have to sort of dirty your clothes while crossing the road. There's a lovely touch here on the side. There is some graffiti, and it is showing, it looks like a gladiatorial fight. So this would have been the equivalent of a poster in Pompeii. This was very, very popular, particularly when there were sort of coming games and there was a politician who was supporting those games and sort of sponsoring them, putting them on. They'd find these kind of adverts up on the side of buildings. So we've got one of those here. It's a nice sort of hearty porridge there for the gladiators. I'm surprised to see so many of these gladiators all together in one single mess like this. I think that would have been very, very dangerous to have as a situation. In gladiatorial barracks, typically all the weapons were locked away. So the only weapons actually allowed there were sort of dummy weapons, wooden weapons. And there were guards all over the place to try and ensure that fights didn't break out. And if they did, that they were dealt with very, very swiftly. Most of the gladiators would have spent their time in sort of cell-like rooms, essentially, around these barracks, rather than all being kind of living in this very, very communal, lovely sort of way. So I think this is perhaps a glamorization of the reality. It's very, very daring for these gladiators to even get into a fight, because we know actually at the barracks at Pompeii there were even prison cells which had shackles. So if a gladiator was stirring up trouble, there was a very, very harsh punishment for them at the end.
Explain. He did not start it. He was trying to eat.
It's quite nice to see this chap here. He is the gladiatorial agent, he's the trainer, he's known in Latin as a lanista, and the word actually derives from the same word as butcher in Latin, so it gives you an inkling as to just how aggressive he might have been.
Thirsty. Okay. What's wrong?
This is quite a nice detail. We are told that in the days running up to the eruption of Vesuvius, there were earth tremors, or sort of small earthquakes that were felt in Pompeii. So we've got a hint of that here. This looks quite extreme. I think the earth tremors that were leading up to this volcano were quite minor. They weren't enough to deter people. People weren't sort of evacuating the city as a result of it. This is quite an extreme version of what actually happened. But it would have been disconcerting for people, because we know that 17 years earlier there'd been this really quite devastating earthquake which had struck Pompeii. A lot of the buildings had been damaged. The city was actually still in the process of being rebuilt as a result of that earthquake. So any kind of earth tremor was bound to cause some anxiety within the city because of the expense that was actually required to repair what had been ruined in the process.
Everyone out! Move!
Got a very lovely amphitheatre here. This had been newly built in Pompeii, so it's looking very fresh, it's looking very good. It looks actually very, very accurate. I think the surprising thing maybe is that the awning should usually have covered the entire amphitheatre. It's unusual to find in the ancient world an awning covering just part of an amphitheatre, but obviously I think this is a cinematic decision. It's to show us a better view of the interior of the arena. The position of the arena itself is the only thing that isn't right. So it's sort of in the corner like this within the walls, but actually it was orientated slightly more sort of horizontally rather than vertically like this. But you have to be looking very, very closely to spot that. It's interesting actually to see the gladiators training here. Within the barracks in Pompeii, there wasn't actually an arena attached to it, whereas in Rome, in the main gladiatorial school, the Ludus Magnus, there was a sort of a practice arena, and members of the public could come and sit there and watch and sort of discover which gladiators they liked best, who was looking good for that season, who was looking bad, and it sort of helped to stir up interest within the sport. In Pompeii, because there wasn't the equivalent of that, I think it's feasible that some of the gladiators could have been practicing within the arena to get a kind of feel of the space. That said, probably the majority of their exercises would have taken place in the barracks themselves. There was sort of an open space there, sort of square, where they would have been doing a lot of their sort of practice, sort of thrusting with their swords and everything else.
You're getting old, Atticus. Plenty of young flesh out here just aching to take apart a champion.
When I win in the arena tomorrow, I'm a free man. Roman law. And there's nothing you can do about it.
This seems ridiculous. Gladiators did not go into a fight knowing that they were guaranteed to earn their freedom the next day. There was obviously a sort of a different system where they could earn their freedom if they put on a particularly good performance, if they won the support of the crowd, if they won the support of the emperor. The emperor was often looking at the crowd to gauge whether he was popular and whether he should be freed. But you didn't go in with any expectation that you would be winning your freedom as a result of your sort of long service to this point. So this idea of there being a Roman law that guaranteed this is absurd. I love this scene because it's immediately recognisable to a classicist. The Temple of Jupiter, which is tilted to one side, is exactly as it's represented in a relief sculpture that was found in the house of Caecilius Jucundus, who was living in Pompeii. And that is an effect of the earthquake that had struck 17 years earlier. The building's on a tilt as a result of that, and they've captured that perfectly here. This is another great scene. This is showing the marching camp as laid out. It's very, very well organised. It's sort of nice straight lines. It seems very, very Roman, and just as you'd expect it to be, very, very tidy.
Don't worry. Your plan is nothing short of brilliance. Only a madman would advise the Emperor against investing.
Well, let us hope that the Emperor has not sent us one.
Senator, do forgive us for not being able to receive you at the harbor.
Severus, you're a busy man, I understand entirely. Besides, if I had a wife as beautiful as yours, I'd be in no hurry to forsake her company. I am Senator Quintus Attius Corvus. May the gods grace me to bless your kind hospitality.
You're most welcome, Senator.
So, Senator, tell us the news from Rome. How does the new Emperor Titus fare?
The new emperor? The new Emperor Titus fares well.
The Emperor Titus had recently come to the throne, that's right. His father Vespasian had died, Titus had taken over, and he's very early in his rule when Vesuvius erupts. So far, so good there.
His father Vespasian was loved by his people, and they continue that love for his son.
As the gods demand.
Indeed. Severus, I have a question for you. On my journey from the harbor, I noticed some of your townfolk turn their backs towards me. There wouldn't be some kind of problem, would there? Some local resentment against Rome?
No, nothing of the sort. A minuscule minority of opposition to our plans. But our new construction will provide the people with a new aqueduct, better sanitation, bigger bathhouses, a new arena, a whole new Pompeii.
The idea that there is some tension, though, between Rome and Pompeii is quite bizarre. Pompeii was one of the cities that grouped together with other towns in Italy to fight against Rome in a civil war called the Social War, but that was back in 91 BC. We're now talking AD 79, so generations had passed since that point. There's no reason why they shouldn't have been on fairly good terms by this point, so this seems like a slightly bizarre decision. It's true that new building works were taking place in Pompeii. For the most part, those were quite domestic. There were sort of repairs going on to buildings. There were sort of changes happening, but this sounds like there's some dramatic overhaul being planned, sort of rebuild the city entirely, which doesn't quite ring true.
All right. You, here. You, barbarian, here.
Both excellent fighters. One a champion, the other tried and proven in the provinces.
I want to see him from behind.
Why so serious? Not so bad for a night's work.
What this scene captures quite well is the difficult position that was occupied by gladiators, because on the one hand, a lot of them are slaves, they're servile, there's nothing they can really sort of do on their own terms. On the other hand, they are really the sort of the heartthrobs of the ancient world, and they have sort of the idea of women fawning all over them is an idea that kind of comes up in literature a lot. So they're sort of very, very desirable, and yet at the same time they don't really have any real power. I think what's really sort of pushing the boundaries here is the idea that respectable, wealthy women would be fawning all over these muscular gladiators in the full gaze of everybody else in the middle of a party. It seems slightly strange. I mean, women, particularly if they were married, it was a complete no-no. They can't be flirting with other men openly like this. This just wasn't the done things. This is kind of pushing a trope, an idea that had kind of arisen in literature and in popular culture, but it's showing it actually playing out, which probably wasn't a common occurrence. There is a huge crowd piling into the amphitheatre for the start of the games. This would have been exactly the case. The amphitheatre could host about 20,000 people, so more than the number of people who lived in Pompeii itself. People would have been coming in from surrounding towns as well. This is unexpected, to be sort of launching straight into a kind of a battle scene like this, because there was usually a sort of a set formula for gladiatorial combat days. So there would have been a procession, there would have been a sort of usually a dummy round where the audience would have been sort of warmed up by watching people fight, with there being no prospect of the gladiators actually dying or being bloodied. They'd have been using wooden swords and sort of, not their proper equipment. So instead, we seem to be launching straight into the action, which is slightly unexpected.
What is this?
This is your greatest moment, Atticus. The final day in the arena.
I'm supposed to fight single combat.
Bring them their weapons!
Good fortune, Atticus.
This line, "We who are about to die salute you," is always used in ancient films like this, but actually we only know of it being used in one particular circumstance, and that was under the Emperor Claudius, decades earlier than this, before a Naumachia, a kind of a sea battle that took place. So not a gladiatorial combat scene like this.
The patronage of Marcus Cassius Severus, and for the glory of Emperor Titus, remember all here the mighty victory of Senator Quintus Attius Corvus and his annihilation of the Celtic rebellion.
The Celtic rebellion.
Your great and noble victory for the Empire, Senator. Reopening the northern trade routes, the history books record it as your finest hour. I thought perhaps you might like the honor of opening these games in a similar manner.
Severus, you flatter me.
It's good we have the announcement of the sponsor of this, because it reminds us of the political basis of gladiatorial shows and broader public entertainments. There was a reason these things were put on. Bread and circuses were a way of winning votes for people. So we have the sort of the link to the man who's behind this and what he's wanting to get out of it at the end of the day. He's crushing grapes here, not because that was standard practice, but because this is taking place during the festival of the Venalia. It's a wine festival, it's a festival held in honour of Bacchus. So this is a nod to that, it's trying to set it at a particular time.
This isn't a battle.
What?
This is a massacre.
How do you know?
Because I was there.
The rebel Celts are in retreat!
And these are very unusual, I think, to modernise in particular, to see these masks. They're quite frightening, but people were used to this in the ancient world. People went to the theatre in ancient Greece, even they had masks much like this with people behind them. So it's quite sort of disconcerting to the modern eye, but it would have been familiar to the audience.
Quintus Attius Corvus gave them every chance to surrender. But mercy was an alien concept to these savages. And with heavy heart, Quintus Attius Corvus ordered his mighty legions in the name of the Emperor to attack! Shields up!
The irritating fact is that it seems very, very unlikely that gladiatorial games would have been taking place when the eruption of Vesuvius did occur. Otherwise, we would have found a lot of evidence of bodies within the amphitheatre. So the whole sort of setting of this seems off. Okay, we've got the beginning of the complete drama here. We've got sort of earthquakes. The volcano is really properly waking up at this point. I mean, it's slightly jarring, I have to say, to see the scene full of people in the amphitheatre, because it seems very, very unlikely that there would have been people in the amphitheatre to this extent during the real eruption of Vesuvius, because otherwise we would have found a lot more human remains than we have within the arena. So this seems a fiction, but I think possibly it's a nod to the fact that in AD 64, there had been a really, really devastating earthquake during the rule of Emperor Nero, just after a performance in the theatre in Naples. So possibly they're referencing that by having this scene here. The beginning of the eruption actually looks quite accurate. We're told that there was this huge billowing cloud that rose out of the top of Vesuvius, and it was a mushroom cloud. It was likened to an umbrella pine tree, which are found everywhere in Italy, and that looks a little bit like this. Complete shock on people's faces. Obviously, people had no idea what was going to occur. This cloud actually would have risen to over 30 kilometres, so we're seeing quite an extreme form of that happening. Now this is really, this is pushing things way too far. This is the collapse of the amphitheatre. I mean, we still have the amphitheatre, we can still visit it, and there have been repairs that have been made to it, but nothing like the extent of this. The amphitheatre did not collapse to such an extent during the eruption. complete crush of people. I mean, this is realistic. We know that when people were trying to escape during the eruption, there was a massive crush. People were pushing past each other. There was a real threat of being trampled. And this is a really nice detail. We're now down beneath the amphitheatre. We're in the Hypogeum. And this was a sort of subterranean area, and it looks absolutely accurate, but for the fact that there wasn't a Hypogeum in the amphitheatre in Pompeii. There were in other cities and other amphitheatres, they had them, but there actually wasn't one here, so I'm sorry. We've got the complete covering over of the sun, sort of almost an eclipse by the cloud, and this is actually what Pliny, the eyewitness of this, actually describes in his letters, in his first-hand accounts. He said that it was almost like someone had switched off a lamp in a darkened room. Everything went so pitch. And we're seeing that here. We've got sort of lightning across the sky as well. Pliny said it was almost like lightning in the sky. This is not familiar from Pliny's accounts, sort of meteors leaping out of the top of the volcano. I think this is dramatic. It looks spectacular. It looks almost like a firework display, but probably not at all accurate. I think in reality, when people were escaping, there was a lot of masonry that was falling down. There was a real sort of risk of being crushed by falling buildings. But most of the time that's because of the weight of the pumice fall rather than meteors actually landing on them. There's not such considerable evidence of burning as this to suggest that sort of most of Pompeii was on fire. So I think this again is too extreme. So what we know is coming from this great cloud that's rising up out of the volcano, there was a huge amount of pumice fall. And this was actually sort of weighing up, and it was building up outside people's houses, so people were actually getting trapped inside because there was so much of it. But you also got from this cloud these things called lapilli, so they're kind of small stones, and some were larger, some were smaller. People were, Pliny the Elder, one of the victims of the volcano, when he was trying to escape, he actually put cushions on his head, and people were doing so, strapping pillows and cushions onto their head to try and protect themselves from all this sort of falling masonry and stone and sort of, various bits of pumice as well. But there was nothing like the scale of this. There weren't so these giant meteors hitting them all over the place. Like we would have found a reference to that in the written sources. Oh my goodness, we seem to have a tsunami. We have in our written source, in Pliny the Younger's letters, he describes the sea as being sucked back in on itself and leaving a sort of trail of marine life stranded in its wake. But probably what he was describing was an extreme effect of one of the earthquakes. If there was a tsunami at all, which seems incredibly unlikely, there's no great sort of archaeological evidence for a tsunami taking place. There's no sort of rising waterline, there are no sort of fossils and sort of evidence of marine life elsewhere in the city. If it did exist, it would have been absolutely a very, very small one. It wouldn't have been something on this scale. I mean, this is really, really pushing the source to its furthest extreme. It would be cool though, can you imagine if they did find the evidence of a ship, having said all this, in the middle of Pompeii at some point? You never know, it could turn up, but I think incredibly unlikely. I mean, the amount of damage that they're inflicting on Pompeii in this scene by fire and by water, you'd be amazed that anything had survived at all of the ancient city.
Senator Quintus Attius Corvus. You killed my family. You slaughtered my people, and make no mistake, my gods are coming for you.
What we're seeing here is a series of pyroclastic surges from the volcano. We know that these did take place. Pompeii was really heavily struck by the fourth in a series of pyroclastic flows. And then a sort of a fifth one came and completely buried over what remained of the ancient city. So this looks quite accurate from that perspective. They travelled very, very fast. They were sort of fiery. There were these great balls of, I was going to say great balls of fire, the great balls of rock and burning gas as well, incredibly hot. So for these to sort of confront you, people would have actually essentially been vaporised on coming into contact with a pyroclastic flow.
For those of us about to die, we salute you. I die a free man!
Yeah, this is slightly extreme. So a pyroclastic flow travels between 100 and 400 kilometres an hour. We've got a horse competing with the speed of a pyroclastic flow. It seems incredibly unlikely to me.
Ride him out of here.
No!
He's not fast enough. He can't carry us both. Go!
No, I won't leave you.
We don't have a choice.
Run! Go!
What are they going to do instead? What are they going to do with their final moments? I mean, that is a very annoying continuity error. Previous shot, she's wearing earrings. She's now got no earrings. What happened to her earrings?
Don't look. Look at me. Just me.
For me, I think this isn't actually entirely inaccurate. I think if you knew you're about to die and you're there with a really hunky gladiator, what else are you going to do? It would be much nicer to spend your final moments on Earth like this than running from this inescapable natural disaster. I like, when I'm looking at these final images, I'm seeing the cast of this couple, this newly formed couple, and it does remind me of a particular cast that was found or created in Pompeii, and it's of these embracing people, and they used to be known as the maidens. They thought it was two women. They've now done further analysis, and they think it was probably two men actually embracing. But this seems to be sort of using that as an inspiration. You've got this sort of this couple together in their final moments by looking at that cast. And I think the whole storyline seems to derive largely from the idea that actually a woman, a high-class woman, nicely dressed, covered in jewels, was actually found in the area of the gladiatorial barracks in Pompeii. A lot of other people were found there as well. It seems pretty incredible that she would have been there visiting a lover, but that is the story that came to be told of her, why she was there in the barracks. I think much more likely like a lot of people, she was trying to seek shelter, she was trying to protect herself from the volcanic debris that was sort of raining down on her. But you had this whole mythology deriving of this woman finding herself in the gladiatorial barracks at the end of time. And here we got the story, high-class woman there with her gladiator lover. I said this isn't the greatest of all the kind of classically inspired films that's ever been created. I'd like to have seen actually more about the families in Pompeii and some of the other people rather than focusing so heavily on the gladiators. I think it's almost sort of a combination of the kind of Ridley Scott Gladiator trying to be superimposed on top of this idea of this, huge climactic disaster. But as a film, there's some great cinematic moments and it is very dramatic. You are on the edge of your seat as you see these people facing the absolutely impossible situation that did confront thousands of people in the ancient world. And it does transport you back to Pompeii. I think the recreations of the city and Londinium as well are actually particularly well done. So this film does have some merit. If you'd like to learn more about the history of the city and this period, I've written a book called In the Shadow of Vesuvius, A Life of Pliny, and that explores much the same material but from a factual point of view.